Tell me if this sounds familiar. Explosive new developments in the Russia investigation. Well, we now learn a new report says the president, Trump himself, drafted the initial deceptive statements about Donnie Jr.'s meeting with the Russians. We're going to look at the significance of what this might bring. Then, as you know, the mooch is out, but will the White House communications team ever get its act together? We look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of it all. Also, Democrats may have lost some special elections for Congress recently, but for local and statewide seats, the picture could be much brighter. All that might bode well for Democrats come next November. We'll discuss tonight. Evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. What turns out, I say, is a busy Tuesday, but when is it ever dull in the Trump world? Well, the Russia story just keeps dogging this White House, and tonight it's new revelations about President Trump's role in his son's meeting with the Russians at the Trump Tower leads our show. New White House Chief of Staff John Kelly's first order of business, calming the chaos in the West Wing.
He will do a spectacular job, I have no doubt.
The military man already exercising influence on day one with the resignation of White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci after less than 2 weeks on the job. But now, yet another crisis. We have confirmation that President Trump personally dictated the misleading initial statement released by Don Jr. to the New York Times saying the meeting that he, Jared Kushner, and former campaign manager Paul Manafort had with several Russians with alleged links to the Kremlin was about adoptions and was, quote, not a campaign issue.
The president didn't sign off on anything. He was coming back from the G20. The president wasn't involved in that.
Trump's legal team then denying the president had any involvement. But sources for ABC News and the Washington Post, they are refuting that. Don Jr. later releasing the email chain which confirmed that the meeting was campaign-related and that he thought he was meeting with a Russian government attorney who had dirt on Hillary Clinton.
The idea that the president himself drafted a statement that was misleading, that's a big problem for the White House that's been trying to say he's not been involved.
Today, the White House insisting the president was not directly involved in writing the statement and that the original statement was accurate.
He certainly didn't dictate, but, you know, he, like I said, he weighed in, offered suggestion like any father would do.
I should mention Donald Jr. is nearing 40 years of age, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now, I want to give you a little more detail from that Washington Post story that broke. Now, I'm quoting here directly. Hope Hicks, the White House Director of Strategic Communications and one of the president's most trusted and loyal aides, and Josh Rafael, who's a White House spokesman who works closely with Kushner and his wife, Ivanka Trump. Apparently, they huddled with Kushner's attorneys and they advocated for a more transparent approach. That, according to people with knowledge of the conversations. The strategy, the advisors agreed, should be for Donald Trump Jr. to release a statement to get ahead of the story. They wanted to be truthful, the story reports, so that their account couldn't be repudiated later if the full details emerged. But reportedly, within hours, at the president's direction, the plan then changed. Now, there's another story, and I'm going to get much more into this tomorrow evening with our legal panel, but it deals with the death of a Democratic aide named Seth Rich. You may remember the story that we shared with you a few months ago. There's now a lawsuit that claims the White House urged Fox News to publish a report saying his death was connected to the WikiLeaks release of information damaging to Hillary Clinton. Now, again, we'll talk about this tomorrow, but it should be known that Fox News had to retract the story and say that they got it wrong. There was no truth to this whatsoever. Forget the Rich family reached out repeatedly to Fox asking them to pull the story, which they never did. But now we learn that apparently, and we'll see how this is borne out in the court case, the White House had direct fingerprints on that story. But we come back to our big story of this evening. To help me with that, let's bring in our panel. And to hash out the latest with the Trumps in Russia, we are joined by Jerica Richardson, former spokesperson for Mayor Bill de Blasio, also spokesperson for U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara. To our right, Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. All across the table, got Richard Brodsky, former Democratic New York State Assemblyman, now senior fellow at Demos and a professor at NYU, and Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. All right, lot to unpack here, but first, explain, Jericho, we'll peel back a little bit more, communications, how important they are for any administration, whether it be on the mayoral level, state level, or even on the presidential. But the fact that in the Post story that broke, I read the excerpt where even in bad news, there's the angels and the devils of the telling of it. And apparently, Ivanka and Jared tried to be the voice of reason. We've seen this narrative before. Whenever there's a leaked story, but somebody comes out good, I know it's a generalization, but is it a pretty safe rule, expectation to think that the people that come out good probably knew the story was going to be coming out and want to get their side in it?
You know, that's, I think, a good analysis. Usually if there is a leaked story, someone is informing the story, someone is tied to the story. So I'm sure those people that argued counter to whatever ended up being the final decision wanted to make it known where they stood on that issue, because no one wants to be tainted with that.
So you got Jared and Ivanka, Dominic, Andrew, on one side of the table, and now you got Dad and Donnie Jr. And I couldn't believe when I saw Ms. Huckabee Sanders today say, well, like any dad would, he's going to help out his kid, okay? Again, he's not any dad, he's the president. And unlike any kid, his son's 39. And more than anything of that, most dads aren't under investigation by one Bob Mueller as there's an ongoing Russia probe. And again, this took place in July that this story was coming out. So it wasn't like this took place a year ago on the campaign trail. My God.
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier today. I think this is one of the most significant and potentially catastrophic details that has come out so far for the health of this presidency for a couple of different reasons. At the very best, what we know is that the president's lawyers lied to the country the weekend that that story came out, because they said the president was not involved in drafting this at all. Dig a little bit deeper, the president, if the details of the story bear out, if he actually did, dictate or contribute to this statement, the president lied to the country, because the statement that came out from the White House was false. It was misleading. It was trying to downplay the significance of that meeting.
And just to buffer what you're saying for the folks who don't remember, because there's a fire hose of information every day, if people remember that email thread that we're talking about, first it was, they didn't come clean with this on their own volition. The Times said, we got the story. So they said, all right, well, what's the story? Well, you met with the Russians, you never disclosed any of it. And this has been a recurring problem for Jared Kushner, members of the Trump family, i.e. General Flynn, and a whole bunch of things. Then they said, okay, well, let's do a modified hangout. Well, we met, but we were talking about adoptions. Turns out the email thread shows after the Times says, not good enough, we got the emails. Then the second version of the story after they came out was, oh yeah, because by the way, they promised they had dirt on Hillary Clinton in the campaign. Only after that and only after the emails were that we had a little bit of clarity. But throughout it, the president, to your point, is the one saying, no, no, no. Apparently, Ivanka and Jared, you don't say anything here. Guys, this is what we're going to say instead, when he knew full well it was about Russia and Hillary. It wasn't about adoption.
And this is the statement that we're talking about that came out after the first of those stories, but not when the Times kept updating the story with these details. So we didn't know that, hey, this came from the Russian government was in the title line, or that Manafort and Kushner were at that meeting also. And the statement that the president apparently was involved in drafting reflected that it was just a small casual meeting that happened to be about adoptions. You and I talked about this the Monday we got back, because this story I think dropped on a Sunday. And we said that statement was a cover-up, or an attempted cover-up from the White House. And if the president was involved in that cover-up, well, that's where we are there as well. The other part that I don't get in all this is the president's at the G20 summit. He's just met with Putin twice. He doesn't travel particularly well anyway, and he's on Air Force One flying back, and he's going to stop and draft or dictate the details that are in this statement about his son's meeting with the Russians? I mean, I'm sorry, I think back to the movie Philadelphia, when you have, your number one guy is the guy that you want on the line when everything's happening. And in the midst of all this chaos, Trump made himself the number one guy to draft this thing. To me, that smacks of, well, he's the guy who knows what
And
what
because the
happened.
language was somewhat nuanced, the next logical questions coming out, Dominic, is was an attorney involved here? And then how does this spiral forward? You know, the White House always gets mad because they make the joke, hey, if the president put Russian dressing on his salad, you'd claim it was, you know, some nefarious conspiracy or whatever else. It's as simple as this. Whenever I hear people say, oh, Rich, you guys making such a big deal about Russia. Well, if they didn't lie about something almost every day and give credence that there's more here, and it's like they're pouring gas on the fire every day, I'm sorry, even if you weren't a cynic and you didn't believe that there was nothing there, why are they keep lying and why do they keep doing cover-ups? It's making it worse and worse to the point where you don't even have to be jaded to believe they got something to hide.
Well, you already know the answer to that, Richard. The president, clearly, a first-year journalism student or lawyer student, could tell you that the president is hiding something. It's crystal clear. But be very careful in terms of, it's almost like with Bill Clinton when he was deposed and what is the definition of is. You have to understand, as you well know, politicians are very slick. So the White House can, yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Brodsky, it's true.
Yeah, you mean in,
so,
in a good sense.
So, no. So the White House can say, yes, the president advised his son on the statement, which is probably technically true. But then they could also say that the lawyers were right because he did not draft it. So it's almost like the definition of is.
That's where a segue. So people may not remember my learned friend here was one time candidate for Attorney General in New York State. So you're Bob Mueller now, and this latest revelation comes out
no
in your
crime in lying to the
media.
American people.
Or the media.
Okay, but
Right. And it's not.
what can this then open up?
Almost nothing.
I
From
agree
a-
with you.
In the legal realm.
I agree
wait,
with you.
wait.
Unfortunately, I agree
I don't
with you.
think there's any problem. My shirt button. just-
I noticed. We got to afford to get you a
careful.
button here, but go ahead, yeah.
There's no legal exposure here. He, as a father, he should be involved. As the president, if he's a smart guy, it's helpful to have him on the team figuring out the strategy. The problem is he gave them lousy advice. And the advice was lousy because you can't sustain that kind of lie. You now understand why he's so nuts about the leaks. Because every time he makes up a fib, somebody goes, not really. And that's the problem here. As to the impact of all of this, there is a big chunk of the country that says it's a witch hunt, nothing ever happened, it's not about
Well,
collusion.
the polls are starting to belie that because the latest numbers, Jerica, are worse than they've ever been for this president. And if you do the polling from the trustworthy, believability, and everything else, they're numbers like we haven't seen, short of the full-blown controversy. So explain the 101 about getting ahead of a story, because that was at the crux of this, which was, all right, they got caught. Times got a hold of emails. They said, listen, you had a meeting, you never disclosed it. Clearly, there was one approach they took here, which is give them a little, hope they don't have the whole thing, lie, obfuscate here, maybe it'll all go away. Versus, reportedly, what Ivanka and Jared and their counsel said is, let's get ahead of this, let's do it on our terms. Explain the different thinking there.
Well, the first approach was completely wrong. It was narrow, and they were not thinking big picture at the time, right? It seemed like you're trying to put out the fire, but what you don't realize, unless you tell the story and tell it all, and you'll lose control of the narrative. So they had the opportunity to come forward with this, be transparent from the jump, but they chose not to. And they chose to listen to Donald Trump, who, mind you, is not a communications professional. He is not a lawyer. So he honestly should not have been the person making the call on this. And that's where they got themselves into trouble. They're creating more of a controversy instead of inoculating themselves by just being forward.
The lessons of history tell you that it invariably happens that way. What's wrong with these people?
Unless the final thing that they're trying to hide is so bad that the drip, drip, drip is actually better than disclosing what actually happened.
And I think, because I got to break, I think Andrews hit it. No person, with all the different permutations this story has taken, knowing at least 8 different opportunities to do exactly what Jerica said. Have a sit down on 60 Minutes, get it all out there, say, you know what, yeah, I wanted to get dirt on Hillary, I wanted to do it. There's more here. We all know there's more here. We don't know what it is. We all know there's more. The problem for the president is Bob Mueller is doing his investigation. No one's leaking from his team. From what I understand, at least, he's already gotten into the financial statements of the president, going back tax returns for many years. To me, the president's in panic mode. He wouldn't have been doing what he's doing. We'll find out, I believe. Nothing ever stays hidden anymore in Washington. We'll find out what this is all about, but they're not at least acting like folks that have nothing to hide. All right, coming up next. The Russia story pushed Mooch off the front pages and out of our first block tonight, but troubles with the president's communications team far from over. We're going to take a look at what's wrong here, and also Jerica can tell us what can be done.